Hello, welcome to the Science for Policy podcast. My name's Toby, and today I'm joined by Professor Eric Guilyardi. Professor Guilyardi is a climate scientist. He's based at both the Pierre-Simon Laplace Institute in France, that's IPSL to its friends, and the University of Reading in the UK. On top of his outstanding career in climate science, he's been both a lead author and a contributing author for the IPCC, for instance. He's also president of UNESCO's Office for Climate Education, a member of the National Education Scientific Council in France, and a member of the Ethics Committee of CNRS, the French National Centre for Scientific Research. So, Eric, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Nice to see you, Toby.
How much of your time do you get to spend actually doing climate research these days, as opposed to all the science communication and public engagement and advice and so on?
Well, clearly over the last, say, 6-7 years, that's been reduced because these other activities are taking a fair bit of my time. And you know, when you're a climate scientist, you think, where can I make a difference? So writing the 100 more paper, I'm not sure that's my new, that's what excites me. I'm still doing research with students and postdocs, of course, and I'm following the research. But I think these new aspects of science and society, we really need to invest much more collectively.
Okay, so as part of that then, you were the lead author for some recommendations actually on a topic closely related to what you just said. So published by the Ethics Committee on this question of whether scientists should get involved in public advocacy. Why did you decide to work on that?
This is a story actually which started with, serving for IPCC. And when you are labeled the IPCC author, suddenly you get a huge amount of attention from non-scientists, the media, a number of stakeholders. And so I started to do a lot more public outreach. And then you start to think about, what can I say? What I cannot say? And also a number of us were starting to do that in an individual way and started creating, discussions, even sometimes tensions, saying, oh, you said that, but that's not, what's in the IPCC report. But then, so we started having those corridor discussions and a bit of tension in some cases, or interesting discussions. And so I thought, really, this is a topic that is new for us climate scientists and the wider climate area. And we should really engage in it in a more structured way. So that really led me to start first a discussion group within IPSL, and then joining the CNRS Ethics Committee to, try to properly think about this. And again, that's just one step in, I think, a long journey of joining what many other sciences have done over the history of science, is understanding the links between science and society. I think, we are there for our community now.
Okay. If you felt like you were joining many other scientists going before you, does that mean you had a lot of resources to draw on thinking about this?
Well, of course, there's a lot of reading. This is not a new topic. It's a new topic for us. And clearly this question of public advocacy is by no means new. The huge number of historical examples, think about the Manhattan Project, the question around human biology, and there's all these other sciences have been faced with this. So, and also it's a topic of research in itself, of humanities science, about the sociology or philosophy of science and etc. So first reading about all this, you suddenly discover a huge area, which is a bit intimidating at first. And then, yes, of course, when writing this opinion, we had to, we read a lot, we interviewed a lot of people to try to get a sense of the question, and also to reduce it, to scope it well. Otherwise, it can be a huge topic.
Okay, good. So what did you end up focusing on?
Yeah, so first thing was to define what we're talking about. This is really the first step when you're engaging in this type of exercise. So we call public advocacy. What we mean there, the term is not perfect, but there are no perfect terms. So we decided to pick one and define it well. And basically, we understand public advocacy as any public intervention of an academic researcher or group of academic researchers whose authority is linked to their position in the scientific field. Okay, so they recognize as a scientist, and whose content has a normative aspect. That means an evaluative or prescriptive stance on moral, political, social issues, with the goal of getting people to act. So in that sense, it's very different from what we call public engagement, which would be more vulgarization of science, sharing of knowledge. This is something that is well, we'll be doing a lot that is pretty well organized and recognized and agreed on in our community in terms of values, how we do it, etc. So, of course, there is no tight boundaries between those different aspects, and you can start doing public engagement, sharing your latest paper, and then veer into public advocacy. So, but the goal of this was really to focus on what you define public advocacy. Of course, the usual term of advocacy is wider than this, just how we define it.
Okay, I understand where you're trying to draw the boundaries and that they're not completely crisp, I guess. I get that. But it sounds like the definition you've just given doesn't cover science communication, so that's fine.
Yeah.
But it does cover, or it sounds like it ought to cover, based on what you said, what I would call science advice, science for policy, in that you're consulted as an expert by a policymaker, and you're not just giving some scientific information, but you're also giving some like normative recommendations or instructions.
Well, we discussed a lot about do we include expertise or not, and clearly, as you say, communication as we do it regularly is not included in what we're doing, and actually expertise not. Expertise is also very well organized. Well, it ought to be, and usually it is. Whereas a policymaker will come to an expert asking, okay, I would like to build a bridge. Tell me that carries trucks about how many tons. This is the terrain. Tell me how I should build a bridge. So, the scientist goes and does its calculation, comes back. Okay. Now the decision to make a bridge, how it will look like, the aesthetics, he doesn't care. Now that's simple problems. Now there are a number of what I would call wicked problems that there's no one clear solution. The stakeholder cannot come to the scientist and say, this is what I'd like to do. Climate is one. There are many others like human rights or etc. Because those problems involve a value, worldviews, and this is where the scientist has to be particularly careful to provide the scientific context, but also, and this is where we're going to enter our opinion, and be very clear on where its expertise stops and where its public advocacy starts. As soon as you're dealing with issues that are really important to society and how to live, this is where that boundary becomes fuzzy, and you may be called on as an expert, but do some public advocacy. And the whole point of what we did here is to try to realize when you are doing public advocacy, not to not do it, but realize it and also be clear to the audience that you're doing public advocacy and not just expertise. And IPCC is a good example, where is that motto of being policy relevant but not policy prescriptive. So that's the theory. But then this is where we enter the hard part of actually doing that, or even is it possible?
Yes, I mean, that's what I want to talk about in depth. That's the point of the guidance you've written. But just to be clear, though, the fact that you say public advocacy, you don't mean to exclude conversation with policymakers. That comes under that.
Oh, no. It's no. Of course, yeah.
Right. So tell me a bit more about what is in the opinion.
Right. So basically, this opinion first was we investigated whether this public advocacy is compatible or not with the job of being a scientist. You have a job description, and so clearly, and we work on three aspects. I'll come back to them, and we decided that there is no incompatibility clearly between, on one hand, researchers' public advocacy, and on the other, the norms usually attributed are effectively applicable to research, and so the three dimensions we explore to that were basically first the question of neutrality of science. We hear a lot, and I was the first to think before I started all this, thinking that when I'm doing a public presentation showing the IPCC result, I'm being neutral. And I think we're confusing issues there. So neutral is usually considered an essential condition to producing objective, reliable knowledge, etc. But the problem of the way neutrality is said or perceived by public is that it's value free, which of course cannot be. And rightly so. I mean, we need values to do things, and that's good that we need values to do things. So the mere choice of leaving my lab and doing a public presentation carries values, and recognizing that the tone of the voice I'm going to use, even the way I present things, the graphic, the story I tell, this carries values. There's no way, and it's clearly naive to think that a researcher can entirely set aside its values when doing public advocacy. And science is a human endeavor. We have values, and it's good to share them, and there's nothing to hide there. So this is why we prefer to the term neutrality. We prefer reliability. Reliability means that science comes through a process. It's not an opinion, or there's a very robust process to get to knowledge, but also it deals with human society, with the human. So it's relevant to questions so those two dimensions make science reliable for the public. So that was the first thing. The second thing was, aren't we starting to tread on politicians, or being politicians ourselves, or that boundary between stakeholders and being a politician and scientist? I want to crossing that line. So here again, when you look at it more closely, clearly research is to serve society, is to serve. So it is eminently political in the first sense. It's that everybody's concerned with science, so it should be a political topic. And also, most of us are paid by public money, which is decided by how a country is run or policy. So we have to be in that position of interacting with them. And also, when a scientist speaks in the media, for example, to say we should do that or that, it's clear for everybody that the person is not a politician trying to propose some policy. It's just a scientist speaking it with his own views. So we don't think this is an issue. And lastly, clearly in terms of legal and the requirements of integrity, again, when you look at precisely the rules and regulations that regulate the profession of being a scientist, there's absolutely no rule that prevents that public advocacy. Now, there's one aspect which, of course, is discussed, and we discussed my colleague at Météo France or even the Met Office, is that, of course, when you're working at the Met Office, if you go out in the public saying, the latest forecast is not really, I think it's not very precise, or this might be an issue, of course, because the Met Office has responsibilities, liabilities towards many stakeholders. So you have to restrain yourself from this. But if a researcher from the Met Office goes in the public media saying, I think there should be ways to improve forecasts in general, then there shouldn't be any. Certainly, when you look at the legislation, at least in France, the fact that the civil servant should remain neutral in the sense of not speaking his or her mind, that's actually in the process of recruiting, of evaluating when he has a role in an organization. But as a scientist, he has actually a lot of freedom. Each time scientists have been tried to be silenced doing public advocacy, the European Court or even the national courts have unruled that if there was a ruling against him. So, and that's not surprising. This is the base of democracies. If you have a system that silences those that have a knowledge, this is the beginning of a dictature. So this is really a strong value that we have in our democracies. So that's why it should be highly protected, and it is.
Great. That's Okay. No. Please go on. I don't want to interrupt you because this is really interesting. I'll make a note of points I want to revisit for when you've finished.
Okay, yeah. Maybe this was a long introduction, but just to say there's no incompatibility, and then basically the two main messages of our opinion: one, that public advocacy should be understood as an individual freedom,
Okay.
and that means on one hand, each researcher should remain free to decide whether or not to engage in public debate. That's really important. And a researcher who does engage should not necessarily solicit the support of a broader community. But here we say a but really quickly. And even if we recognize that providing a collective basis is a strength, obviously, that's one of the first important messages, because we hear, for example, their colleagues, and we've seen that at AGU a couple of years ago, where some colleagues went out to say, "Oh, we should all be in the streets demonstrating," but no, this is not part of a job description. It has to remain a freedom to do it, but a freedom not to do it. Then second, we believe that to do so, as you're free to do it. But to engage in that, to do it in I'll say a safe and responsible way. We have to be aware of the responsibility it entails to do public advocacy, not only in terms of the legal liability, of course, that we say, for example, if you do some unlawful things like going on an airway strip to protest against planes, for example, you may end up in jail. Okay, well, that's, but also, and probably more so, in terms of moral responsibility, due to the credibility conferred to the status that scientists have. Scientists are highly trusted in society. They're always at the highest. When you in polls, who do you trust in society? At the bottom, you have politicians and journalists. At the top, you have doctors and scientists. So really, that carries a lot of responsibility. So to do that in a responsible way, basically, the need to put our speech in context and to avoid misleading the audience. And for that, there are two things. First, to situate, we call it, your statement. Are you speaking in your own name? Are you sharing the research of a whole community? What's the level of confidence in what you're sharing, the level of certainty or uncertainty? Are there specific interests or, links that you have with companies, associations, etc.? And also, what values underlie your fact that you're taking a public advocacy, public stance. The second is to put your statement into perspective. What is the status of the scientific findings? Are there remaining uncertainties, as I said? Are there controversies? So the goal is really to stay true to our first mission is to share reliable knowledge and not, for example, exaggerate the story or make it more sexy to have more impact on your audience, but by doing that, crossing a line on the actual level of knowledge of what you're sharing.
That's great. Thank you very much indeed. As I said, thinking about this topic brings up unbidden lots of questions and thoughts in my mind. So I will just pick a few to put to you and we'll see where it goes. So one thing I find very interesting, as you kind of hinted, is civil servants have some requirement for neutrality, at least neutrality in the delivery of their jobs. It's like a principle of their employment. Whereas scientists have kind of the opposite. They have freedom. It's part of their job description that they should express their own views. And indeed, some people have argued it's a duty, although I think you have a bit of a nuanced view about that. But broadly, I think that's a good contrast to draw between the job of a civil servant and the job of a scientist. Then there is the grey area, where you're kind of wearing both hats. For instance, when you're employed by the policymaker as a science advisor, or when you're asked to present your views or present the evidence as you see it in your capacity as a salaried scientist. And I wonder then how you navigate that complexity.
Well, obviously, that's clearly, as you say, a gray area. My main reply to that is to take the time to think, reflect on the legitimacy of what you say. Well, first, the requirement of integrity and rigor is applicable to all. That's clearly. I think there's one distinction, as I was mentioning. If you are in holding a role in an organization, either from the state or some other organization where it's obviously you have to not to jeopardize the position you have in the structure. So if by taking a public stance or public advocacy, you're jeopardizing that, then of course that's an issue. But to me, that should be the call of the person, and it shouldn't be imposed on him or to silence. I mean, of course, an advisor of the government may think that if the government is trying to silence him or ask him not to say things that he thinks are important, he just resigns and then he can say what he wants. So I think this is really a judgment call to be taken by scientists where in the different capacities. Of course, if you're just an academic researcher in university and you're not holding any role either in the university or in some public sense, then your freedom is almost complete in a way, or of course bounded by the law or defamation and etc. As any citizen. But if you are any role you're having, you have to balance out this different. I don't think there's a specific rule. It's everybody's call with their own values, the agreement with their own values, what they deem is more important. Do they keep their role in the system because they think they can influence it, even they might not agree with everything that is done or said, or do they just say, okay, that's too much, I resign, and because I have things to say.
Okay, fair enough. One of the key points you made is one that I haven't seen elsewhere in these kinds of conversations, which is that scientists need not get the backing of their communities. They don't have to collectively organise if they don't want to. You draw this line and say, okay, we might see that it could be very valuable to organise a group together to represent yourselves, but you don't have to. That's your decision. And I want to ask you about that point. Two questions, actually. The first question is just to clarify exactly what you mean. Because I don't think you're just saying, but I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think you're just saying that no individual is obliged to go along with community action that others are organising. If my community is organising a march on the streets or whatever, I shouldn't be obliged to join it out of solidarity or duty or whatever. I don't think you're just saying that. I think you're also saying that if I choose to demonstrate on the street myself, I don't have to do that as part of a collective to recruit others to my cause. I can do it individually if I want.
Yeah.
So then, question one is, am I understanding that right? And then question two, why do you think this is worth saying? Like, no offense, but it seems kind of obvious. Have you encountered arguments to the contrary that make you want to spell it out?
No, I think that the individual freedom is part of that academic freedom, and of course, I mean, freedom. We can spend hours discussing what freedom is and its limits, and it's a topic on itself. But I guess our point is that we see in the community, here and there, people saying that as a community we should do this or that. I guess our point, because this is not part of your job description, the public advocacy, it should remain your own decision, balancing out a number of things, to do public advocacy or not. Now, of course, if you do it collectively, that's better, and again, that's your choice, but your institution, your colleagues cannot impose on you either to do it or to not do it. That's what we mean by it's an individual freedom.
That's kind of, as it were, advice to institutions to say, don't think that you can be putting these kind of constraints on your employees, right? On your researchers.
Yes. So we have a whole section on, how should the institution deal with their, researchers that are on their payroll. Here, yes, we have a few messages towards them. That's the last part of the opinion, where basically we say, well, first, neither encourage nor discourage. It's not on the job description, so there's no expectation from the institution that you should do it, which is somehow, this is where also we draw a line. There's a difference with a public engagement. Public engagement can be on the job description and is valued and is encouraged. And so we don't think that should be the case for public advocacy. So that's the thing. Now, of course, the other one, on the other side, is if a scientist decides through his personal or her personal freedom to do it, the institution should not come and forbid that. And for all the reasons we discussed, and the absolutely need for democracies to have scientists getting. Actually, I should say one of the motivation to do this opinion is not so much for the few scientists that can be very vocal or exaggerate. We see all over the media and we think are crossing lines, whatever. It's for the masses of scientists that don't dare to do public engagement, are afraid, are not interested, or we think there should be much more scientists getting involved in the public discussion about the topics. They have a part of the knowledge, not all of it, of course. So we believe by understanding those different dimensions, our goal is to push more scientists to do public advocacy, but understanding, getting the skills, understanding what it means. So in our advice to CNRS, because this was an advice to the CNRS management, is to draw up a guide and that will list all those dimensions, list the risks, list the resources, to do it in that safe and responsible way we were discussing. And we're very glad because CNRS heard us, which is not always the case. We're just an ethics committee. Sometimes they listen, sometimes they don't. But they heard us and they're in the process of doing that, of drawing up a guide. There's been a massive survey throughout the 20,000 staff of CNRS in France to reflect how to do it, to co-construct it. Again, it shouldn't be a top-down thing. Now, there are also, in our opinion, we have to deal with, you call that in English civil disobedience?
Yeah.
When, for example, Extinction Rebellion, they'll go and, stop the traffic or stop a flight. So, and of course, when there's a scientist that is involved in this, how should the institution react? So we believe first that the research institution should not take the place of the police or the judiciary, and be very careful not to step on the rights of scientists, which is, it's a way of expression. These civil disobedience should be viewed as freedom of expression in a way. Now, if a scientist gets convicted because of his illegal action and that involved crossing some lines in terms of scientific integrity, he exaggerated or she exaggerated things or whatever, then maybe the scientific institution may consider some action against the scientist. It can take different forms. But see, we're very far here. It's many conditions. But the first really reaction of the institution should be protecting the scientist and its his or her expression rights and of being a scientist and having that freedom to express his or herself in the society.
I mean, it's not. So the example you give of where there's some misrepresentation of science or some scientific error, that's not only, as you said, a long way from the starting point, but it's also a different kind of category of problem. Like, it's the business of your university if you're falsifying your research.
Exactly.
But it's not the business of your university the same way if you're speaking to a TV cam representing your science in a particular way or whatever. That's interesting. So I was very happy to read about this advice to institutions and also to hear you talk about it now. I think it's important because actually for quite a lot of your advice, this is advice which seems to place a lot of, I suppose not place responsibility, but it seems to point out quite a lot of responsibility that is on the shoulders of individual scientists, which in one sense is fine because you're saying, you are talking about individual scientists. But then when you talk about them, you put quite a lot of stuff in their category. So just the things I've noted down as you've been talking, you say they should situate their contribution, right? They should understand when they're communicating in their own name. They should kind of regulate their own speech and be careful to be clear when they're going beyond their expertise. And more, like I think it's a whole big thing. They should declare their own interests. They should identify their own values. This is a lot. So my question is, are you sure that should be all on the individual and they can't draw on any help from elsewhere in doing that? And secondly, if so, how practical is that to expect of someone? Yeah,
no, that's a very good question that occupied us a lot. I mean, you can say this is nice and theoretical, or that long, laundry list of things you should do. And clearly that list should not prevent people from getting engaged into public advocacy. This should not be viewed as a barrier to do it. It's really listing all the risks that carry the fact that doing public advocacy, which, most scientists are well aware. This is why they don't engage in public advocacy. Your reputation, your scientific reputation is at stake. Many things are at stake. So you really so I think so all these requirements in a way are really a guide to do it in a safer and responsible way. Now, up to now, and it depends on the countries and the situation, but up to now, especially in climate science, scientists were really on their own when they're going there. So already this is why so few do it. So I guess, and this is why we are advocating for those guides. I think that the scientist should not be left on his own or her own. And I spend a lot of my time presenting those opinions so that it becomes a shared collective organization, something that is not discussed in corridors or put under the carpet, but is a real, in the same way we have discussion about advice to policymakers. This should be a subject by itself so that we get all collectively educated about it. And I think that the advice we give to the scientists is really take a time to reflect about what such public advocacy entails. And just that time of reflection, will save you in many accounts. And it's the same way when you advise to do media training before you go being an interview. Otherwise, you're running into trouble, and you may get lucky with a good journalist, but that's not always the case. So really, you have to build an understanding of what is it that you're engaging into, developing the skills to do it. Some people have natural skills. Some people, they need to develop. And certainly for us at the PSL, and what motivated me to create that think tank or within IPSL and then write this is our young researchers that come in our labs. Many of them come on a mission to save the planet. So there's really strong values. Some of them can be surprised that, the older generation looks like they're not really engaged, they don't care, they don't do public advocacy. And we owe it to those young generation to be much more professional in the way we deal with those questions and the way we organize ourselves on those questions. So this is really, to me, a strong motivation to get engaged in this.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I guess that must be a feature in a few fields of science, but I can understand why it's not all, and I understand why you can see it in climate science. You have the older generation who got into it because they're interested in climate science, and then you've got the younger generation who might have got into it because they're interested in, helping the world not get destroyed, the world that they have to live in.
Yeah.
And I think that's a challenge that other fields of science must have faced from time to time as they've become more central in the kind of societal attention.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So on that, when I first heard you speak about this, it was at an event for early career researchers, so run by the EGU, the European Geosciences Union. And one strong thread of responses that you got from people, several questions along these lines, was about this issue that scientists sometimes feel they would love to engage in public advocacy, but they're cautious about doing it because they feel like they lose control of their message once it's out in the wild, as it were. And you give quite detailed advice about how scientists should approach their own advocacy and how they should present themselves and so on. Do you have any advice to reassure those kinds of people about how to increase the chances that all that careful work they're doing is preserved and still has an effect when their message gets into the hands of journalists and the public and so on?
Yeah, so that's actually, there's a really nice PhD thesis from the University of Reading by Lydia Messling, who worked on this, and so she has that advocacy target with different, possible advocacy choices where you want to sit. And then she says there are contextual factors that may deflect the arrow or your arrow where you're trying to hit that target. And for example, you may be doing science communication, just sharing a result, and be viewed as doing public advocacy. It's not just depending on you, but on the political context. For example, in the US, if you're just the mere fact of being a climate scientist is viewed as doing advocacy, even if you don't open your mouth. So I guess one aspect is to understand those contextual factors and try to mitigate this. And this is why, situating your statement, stating your values, saying why you're coming. And for many years, I wasn't doing that. And I could see in the audience when I was doing public presentation in front of 100 people come to you presenting the latest IPCC results or something like this, or the All of the Ocean Climate or whatever. I would see some, say, okay, he's a scientist. Okay, we're listening to him. But they were thinking, why is this guy here? And they were right asking them this question. What is his hidden agenda? And so now what I do is upfront, I explain to people why I'm here. Why did I leave my lab to come in front of them? And this is where I state my values. I say, for example, climate change has the potential to create human suffering in the next decade. And so for me, coming towards you to share a bit of knowledge and discuss together what we can do to confront that challenge is important. Okay. And then suddenly you have a different attention from the audience when you do that. So I think that's an important part of taking into account your audience, so that the message you want and the advocacy you want to do is actually perceived as is and not transformed. Now, of course, there are places where you cannot do that. And for example, there's some media outlets where I don't go anymore because I know that my speech is going to be transformed to their agenda, whatever I say. So I'm not just engaging with those anymore. So this is really about educating yourself on how what you're sharing and what you're exposing is perceived.
Yeah, that's very smart advice. It struck me also when you were talking that this idea of situating yourself and expressing your values not only kind of improves, or not only has a chance to improve the perception of the audience so that it aligns with what you want to say, but it also allows people to identify that if their values differ, they can then understand which part of what you're saying they might want to interpret differently, as it were, right? You can make that distinction between the values which can differ and the objective evidence which ought not to differ, which we ought to have in common.
Exactly. And I think, when you think about environmental challenges, there's been a lot of the deniers saying, that doesn't exist, there's no climate change, no loss of biodiversity, etc. I think when you scratch, it's not about the science, which was very relaxing when I found that out, because, first you think like, oh, well, this person thinks I'm a liar or I do bad research. This is very disturbing at first. But then when you understand it's not about science, it's about values and worldviews, at the same time, you're much more relaxed. You don't feel attacked in what you are as a scientist, but also it helps you understand that the debate, and rightly so, is about, what world we want to live in, what values, what level of risk we're ready to take, how do we balance out the different risks, and etc. And to me, it's also being a bit more humble. The media and the stakeholders love putting, the people that know on the front, but maybe also the fact that for decades we've been, raising the alarm and nobody was listening. Our message may have become a bit more simplistic and forceful. But now that it's heard, I think we have to understand the complexity of the real world. And it's when you take a decision, you have to balance out a number of conflicting, requirements or wishes. So it's understanding that the debate, what do we do about climate change, is not a scientific debate. It's a political debate. It's about what do we value, what is important. And now, certainly, I finished my presentation with this, and I can see it's not to say that it's not important, we should do about it, but it's not the end of the world as well. It's a challenge we have, like many others, like all the Sustainable Development Goal challenge or challenges that all create human suffering. Now, how do we address them is part of our political discussion, locally, regionally, or globally. So to me, understanding that is really the way to be pertinent when we interact with the society. Otherwise, we risk being very naive or instrumentalized by whoever, NGOs, political parties, media. And to me, the big risk is that which is really the worst risk, is that we become irrelevant. And there are very few of us having that knowledge about climate science. So we should really make sure that the relevant knowledge arrives at the right place, but not too far.
Okay, well, I was going to leave the conversation there, but I can't resist asking you to expand a little bit more on what you were just beginning to talk about at the end there. Because when we're considering how we as a scientific community communicate about climate change towards the public, I think there are different perspectives, and the perspective you just raised is a very interesting one, which is not perhaps universally shared. So could you say a little bit more about this? I'm not quite clear whether you're being tactical in giving that advice to not be too dramatic, or whether you really believe that climate change isn't the kind of issue that deserves that kind of drama.
No, well, this last part to me is clearly what's another book of Mike Hulme, which is who really has an interesting thought about is that climate change isn't everything. So the risk of ending up in what he called a new ideology called climatism, and this puts in mirror a lot of questions to the scientific community and all, especially in the public advocacy. So in the framing of problems, the fact that everything suddenly is framed through climate change, through climate, whereas it's one of the elements of many others, and there's no reason it should be the first one or the forefront one. And I see some colleague scientists have created narratives, like for example, planetary boundaries or tipping points, which today there's no scientific agreement on the mere existence of tipping points. It's an interesting scientific question, but we don't know if there are global climate tipping points, and biologists don't know if there are biology tipping points. Locally, we do know, but globally, we have no idea. And so this notion of planetary boundary is created to make, what I call the fear project, thinking that, if we scare people, they're going to act. But again, if we, start reading experts on psychology, they'll tell you the exact opposite. Well, actually, it's more complex than that. Fear might be important to realize a risk. So you take out the head of the sand and say, or of your daily routine, not just the sand, your daily routine, say, something is happening. Okay. But then as soon as you have the attention, you have to come back to, more measured and taking care of the complexity. And if you continue in the fear, then you create anxiety, which, limits completely the action. So I'm spending currently some time trying to see how we can provide alternative narratives than this doom and gloom coming from those planetary boundaries.
Okay, that's really interesting. Thank you. And then again, I have one more question, but I can't help myself. You just were talking about areas where you say there's no scientific agreement. So you mentioned this concept of planetary boundaries and tipping point, where the scientific community itself doesn't have a consensus.
Okay.
Do you have advice then for public advocacy in these areas? As a scientist, if I'm communicating on these areas or giving advice to policymakers or campaigning for change or whatever, what are my obligations? Should I describe the controversy? Am I allowed to privilege my own view when I talk about it? Should I seek out a scientist who disagrees with me to present their views too? What's the deal there?
I think it's okay to share about debates that happens in the scientific community. It's better that we do it than let others do it, which may, end up in very caricatural views and are plainly wrong. It's part of giving the level of certainty on the topic. I'll give you one example, which is my field of research, is the fate of El Nino in a changing climate, for example. So El Nino is a massive entrainal anomaly that happens in the tropical Pacific with important impacts on the society. So understanding if it's going to change or not in the future, become more frequent, become more stronger, etc., is an important research question that is not resolved yet. Now, some of my colleagues, for example, they look at corals, and in their corals, they see an increase at the end of the 20th century, or some in their model in the future. But again, if you take the IPCC report, which provides you a synthesis of the knowledge and where there's agreement, the consensus, basically, we don't know today really what. So I present that this way, saying we don't know. There are some studies, a couple of studies that have shown that there might be an increase in the frequency of extreme El Niños, strong El Niños. Okay, but there are limitations because it's done through models, but it's interesting because we understand the mechanism, but we don't know it will happen or not. To just not just statistics, etc. So I give some background, and then I've seen colleagues going out in the media saying, "Oh, El Niño is going to change, and etc., or it's going to be a tipping point," or and then I will go to them via email saying, "Where's your evidence?" And of course, they'll show one paper, and then but we don't really have at the moment community discussions on what we should say. I think this is also part of the personal freedom of a researcher to go and say, spin things off the way they want. But to me, some of them are crossing that line. So I think it's, and the reason for them to do that can be multiple, can be attracting more funding to their research, can be they're really personally, feeling scared about what will happen in the future, but more emotionally than rationally. And actually, one of the last El Niño expert gathering I made a presentation about these issues, so that we collectively grow. So not trying to say you shouldn't go to the media and say this, but saying, okay, look, this is what responsibility we have. This is what it entails to go in the public and say those things. This is the impact it may have. So I think controversies, there are always scientific controversies, of course, is how we move forward in science. First, they should be resolved in our scientific community, in journals and in conferences, obviously not in the media. But then when you go into the media, I think it's important, or in doing public advocacy, that you actually, being honest about what the debate is in the scientific community, even though you might be on one side of the debate, but recognizing that there is a debate.
Yeah, this is such a fascinating and complex topic. I have to say your response to it and the advice you're giving in this document are not only very thoughtful, but also in some ways quite reassuring. So thank you very much, Professor Eric Guilyardi, for this conversation. And I hope you achieve your aim of helping and supporting more scientists to get involved in public advocacy.
Well, thank you for this opportunity, and thank you for that incredibly useful blog you're doing.
The Science for Policy podcast is created by the Scientific Advice Mechanism to the European Commission. It's produced and presented by Toby Wardman, with additional editing by Nina Skorczak. The Scientific Advice Mechanism provides evidence-based expertise and policy recommendations to inform policymaking in the European Commission. This podcast is funded by the EU via the SAPEA Consortium. Our theme music is composed by Carlo Alfredo Piatti and performed by Elisaveta Shushenko.